Another day in Iraq, another day of death and violence. As the US meets arch foe Iran to discuss the security crisis, can they really make any headway? And what does each side really want? This is Inside Story. Hello, I'm Imran Garda. They've been meeting for just the second time in 27 years. But has anything good come out of it? The US and Iranian ambassadors to Iraq have been addressing, they say, only the country's security issues. They say they've agreed to set up what they're calling a tri-party security subcommittee for further talks. But is there enough common ground to achieve anything positive? Iraq's Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki, who opened the meeting, appealed to both sides to come together to help solve his country's crisis. The talks come amid a torrent of accusations leveled at each other. Tehran accuses Washington of sponsoring what it calls subversives and running a network of spies and saboteurs in its border areas, regularly detaining and harassing Iranian diplomats in Iraq. The US claims they're members of Iran's military and intelligence apparatus, and being the greatest source of instability in the Middle East through its occupation of Iraq. For its part, the US accuses Iran of supplying Iraqi insurgents with money and weapons, causing the deaths of scores of US troops, and of undermining US efforts to achieve stability in Iraq. The Iranian presence in Iraq is not in dispute. What is in dispute is just how deeply involved the Iranians are in the country. The US has long accused Iran of destabilizing the situation in Iraq.
What we do know is that the Quds force was instrumental in providing these deadly IEDs to networks inside of Iraq. That we know that. And we also know that the Quds force is a part of the Iranian government.
Iran's uranium enrichment program continues to attract controversy too. The US is the program's loudest critic and has led calls at the UN Security Council for tighter economic sanctions against Iran. In May, US President George Bush questioned Iran's nuclear program.
The world has spoken and said, no nuclear weapons programs. And yet they're constantly ignoring the demands.
Iran, from its side, denies interfering in Iraq and instead points the blame squarely at the US administration for Iraq's situation. In an exclusive interview, Manouchehr Mottaki, Iran's foreign minister, spoke to Al Jazeera in June.
The main topic is to change the wrong policies of the United States in Iraq. The policies which were the causes of ongoing situation of Iraq.
The foreign minister also rejected US and international suspicions over its nuclear program.
In Iran, we are talking about the peaceful nuclear activities. We are talking about the nuclear energy. That is the right of all member states who are committed to their membership to the NPT and the IAEA.
Well, joining us now are our guests in Washington. Raymond, a professor of political science at Georgetown University, is also an adjunct scholar at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. In Tehran, Mohammad Morandi, a professor and head of the North American Studies Department at the University of Tehran. And in Amman, Makki al-Nazal, a prominent Iraqi journalist who now resides in Jordan. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Mr. al-Nazal, if I could speak to you first. Critics would say that nothing came out of that initial meeting in May at the Neighbours Conference. That leaves very little room for optimism come this time round.
Well, Iraqis are always optimistic about themselves. We are not really optimistic about any foreign power in Iraq. They are the disease. They cannot be the solution. All what we received before out of many meetings that happened during 4 years was some promises and more disputes between conflicting parties inside Iraq. Those players should realize that Iraqi security should come first, and Iraqis are not really optimistic about both of them, any of them. we are only optimistic about our own people. And the Americans should know that the same way they accuse Iranians of interfering in Iraq, which is true, they are also interfering in Iraq. But the difference is that the Americans are responsible, not the Iranians. Americans are holding the land. They are the occupation power in Iraq. According to the international law and all other laws, they are responsible for maintaining peace in Iraq and stopping any other interference in Iraq.
Raymond Tanter in Washington, pretty scathing criticism of the Americans in Iraq. Are they the main disease in Iraq?
Well, to switch the metaphor, I would ask, what does it take to create a fire? Because Baghdad is blazing. It takes a spark to generate the heat. It takes the fuel, and it takes oxygen. Of course, the spark was provided by the American-led invasion, followed by the occupation, which set fire to the fuel of sectarian differences that were there for 1,300 or so years. But the oxygen comes from Al-Qaeda and from Syria and from Iran. Now, at issue is, how do you put out a fire? I would say that you can remove the occupation, withdraw American troops, and the sectarian differences would subside if it weren't for the fact that Iran is supplying sophisticated roadside bomb technology to Iraq, which causes the Americans not to be able to leave. American forces cannot leave under fire. So if Iran wanted the United States out of Iraq, all the Iranian regime would have to do is to stop sending the explosively formed projectiles, the sophisticated IEDs about which President Bush spoke, and America would be in a much better position to withdraw, and Baghdad could stop burning.
Very philosophical look at it. Mohammad Morandi, is Iran fanning the flames of the fire? What about these accusations of Iran arming and equipping militants in Iraq through the Quds Force? How credible are those claims? And if you could just demystify what the Quds Force actually is.
Well, first of all, in the eyes of Iranians, this is completely untrue. In the Baker-Hamilton report, for example, that came out earlier, there was no talk of Iran being involved with the militant groups in Iraq. The Iraqis themselves, the government, has never claimed that Iran was involved. Iran is supporting the Iraqi government. The Iraqi government has very good relations with Iran. It's very, the problem really lies with the United States. They're blaming Iran. They're looking for a scapegoat to draw attention away from their own failings. The reality on the ground is that Iran, if it really had the intention of attacking American forces, American casualties would be far higher than what they are today. So I think the main problem is that the United States is obsessed with Iran. The United States has a deeply entrenched hostility towards the country, and this is preventing the current regime, the Bush regime in Washington, from taking a more realistic position on Iran. The Quds forces, they are part of the Revolutionary Guards. All the Iranian institutions in the country, they're cooperating with Iraq, the Iraqi government on the borders, in Iraq, in Iran, and the Iraqi government hasn't complained. So why should the Americans realistically be able to claim that Iran is involved?
Well, let's look at something that has come out of this particular meeting. Maki Nazal, the tripartite security panel has been established or will be established. What are the benefits of that?
Well, I mean, I don't know what has come out of that meeting except the same talking about one day and promises and this will be and
are you skeptical?
Actually, I do not expect much out of the two sides, the Iranians and the Americans. They seem to be very happy about what's going on in my country. They seem to be very happy about the bloodshed in my country. the fire that our friend in Washington was talking about, of course, Americans have ignited it by invasion and occupation. But the oxygen was also American. Yes, there was oxygen from Iran. And Iran, I don't know how come he accuses Iran alone and Syria. I mean, there are 35 countries participating in that fire. And nobody has ever tried to extinguish that fire. So two men meeting, it's only to buy time, and each of them will sell some story to his own people. They are both in bad situations inside their countries. And our friend in Tehran denies Iranian interference in Iraq. That's very strange. He says the government hasn't complained, but they have complained. Maliki complained. Muwafaq al-Rubai, who is very close to Iran, has complained. And so many others from the Iraqi coalition have complained. We all complain of others interfering in our private affairs in Iraq. And American withdrawal will be part of the solution. Of course, they should apply enough pressure on Iran not to take their place in Iraq after they leave, which is expected. But nevertheless, we pray to them to take a more serious step rather than two ambassadors meeting over coffee and God knows what they have agreed for. We are not there, even if the government is there, the Iraqi government. The Iraqi government is not really a representative of our people. You can see the parliament, you can see what's going on the Iraqi map. This government is not representing all Iraqis. So some Iraqis should attend those meetings to see whether they are serious or not. And President Bush promised us 6 months. I was here in this same place when I heard him say, please give us 6 months. And it's over 5 months past that promise. And the situation is worse because of the Americans and the Iranians and God knows who else, even the British and the Polish and the others. 45 countries are there. So I'm not only blaming Iran. Americans, yes, want a scapegoat and they want to accuse Iran and Syria. I agree with my friend in Iran, Mohammed. But that doesn't mean that Iran is the innocent party in this equation.
Well, one of the issues officials say isn't on the agenda is the detainees both the US and Iran are holding. Since January, the US has been holding 5 Iranians in Iraq. The US accuses them of providing guns, arms and training to insurgents. The Iranian government say they're diplomats, and Iran is currently holding 4 Iranian Americans. It claims they've been acting against Iranian national security. Last week, 2 of them were shown on TV confessing to their alleged involvement in trying to bring about change in the Iranian government. The US has demanded for their release. Saeed Mohammad Morandi, do you feel that the detaining of people on both sides are symptomatic of the thorny relationship between the two countries?
Well, while I don't want to judge any about the Iranians who were arrested inside the country, but in general, I think that the two really can't be compared. The 5 that were detained in Iraq, they were taken hostage. The Iraqi government was completely opposed to the actions of the American military. The Iraqis said that they have been there for years and that they have no problem, and they have had no problem with these people. But the Americans seem determined to, I guess, take them as bargaining chips. The problem in Iran is that the United States is officially interfering in Iran's internal affairs, and this makes it very complicated for people in Iran and people like me, academics who want to establish ties with academics abroad in the United States from doing so, because there is suspicion about who are the Americans funding, what are the Americans trying to do in the country. On the other hand, the Americans are funding terrorist organizations in Iraq and in Pakistan. So the two are very different, but I think that if the Americans truly want to establish better relations with Iran, they have to stop interfering in the country's internal affairs and I think they should withdraw their forces from Iraq. As I said earlier, the Iraqi government, by and large, is very close to Iran. They're very friendly with Iran. The Prime Minister is friendly as well. Iran has encouraged the Iraqi government to be more inclusive so that the situation within the country will improve. But so I largely think that Iranians blame the Americans for the situation.
Raymond Tanta, in response to the Baker-Hamilton report, Manucher Muttaki said Iran will support any policies returning security, stability and territorial integrity to Iraq. Do you believe him?
I think Foreign Minister Muttaki is a symbol of the problem because with respect to the Quds force, coming across the border in the Meran crossing, bringing explosively formed projectiles is not a source of stabilizing the country of Iraq. We know in America, I've served at the White House, at the Pentagon, at the State Department, and I have friends there now who inform me that we know for sure in the North Tehran section of Levizan, we know where the houses are, where the explosively formed projectiles are being manufactured. And to say that the Quds force of the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, 5 members who were arrested, were not involved in these arms transfers is simply false. In addition, I would suggest that the group that Professor Morandi talks about, the Americans are supporting and funding terrorists. The United States provides, under Article 27 of the 4th Geneva Convention, protective custody to the 3,500 members of the Mujahideen al-Khalq, which was the armed wing of the National Council of Resistance of Iran, and they have refugee status under the UN High Commissioner of Refugees.
Mr. Tanta, can I interrupt you? I'm sorry to interrupt you. I'd like to give Sayyid Mohammad Morandi a chance to respond to that because he was smirking while you were talking. And I also want to ask you, Sayyid Mohammad Morandi, is Iran negotiating from a position of strength or weakness?
Well, I do think that Iran is negotiating from a position of strength because the Americans are growing weaker and weaker in the region. They've lost credibility in the region. And Iran has grown stronger day by day, largely due to American policies, ironically. But the reality is that the Americans are funding terrorist organizations. Just yesterday, a senior figure of this terrorist organization was interviewed on Fox TV, on Fox News. But beyond that also, the Americans have always been sure about things. They've been sure about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq as well in the past. The Americans really have no credibility in the eyes of the people of the region. And people know that the Americans, it's time for them to go. The American government has to leave Iraq. The later they go, the more trouble they cause for themselves. They can put the blame on Iran, but they're not going to solve their problem. If the American government chooses to behave wisely, if it chooses to change its behavior and act more reasonably, then they can go down a path where things could become much better. The very fact that the Americans have agreed to establishing a security subcommittee shows that they are very slowly doing what Iran has called for in the first place. But I think that this administration is too arrogant and too stubborn to really move fast enough to change the situation on the ground. And I think that the Americans are heading for big problems in the future.
Well, while the United States works with a Shia-led government in Iraq, the US-Shia relationship is becoming increasingly complex. Some opposition to the US comes from a Shia group that is part of the Shia coalition leading the Iraqi government. In April, Muqtada Sadr's bloc pulled out of the government to protest about US presence in Iraq. That boycott lasted more than 2 months. Among Sadr's supporters, Iran, which is predominantly Shia. But the US says Iran's support extends beyond the political and accuses Iran of supporting militant Shia groups in Iraq, ones that fight American forces. Iran also supports Hezbollah, the Lebanese Shia group that went to war with Israel last year. The US considers Hezbollah a terrorist group and supported Israel during that war. Makia and Nazal, I want to bring you in here. How difficult does that complex Nouri al-Maliki, United States, Muqtada Sadr triangle, if you would have it that way, make it for Iran, US and the Iraqi people themselves?
Well, it's a funny picture I'm looking at right now. It's really complicated and not clear. I should admit that I really don't understand that the people who came from Iran are ruling Iraq with American support. My two colleagues were talking about supporting terrorism in Iraq. Well, okay, that Iraqi and army and police force, they appear to be infected with terrorism one way or another. I'm not going to talk in a sectarian way because it's a shame. I really hate it. But they are receiving salaries from the Americans, and the Americans say they are receiving support from Al-Quds army or whatever in Iran. It is a rather complicated picture that makes most Iraqis now believe that the real thing under the table is that the United States government and the Iranian government are cooperating to destroy Iraq. You might look at that as a peculiar maybe assessment, but that's what the majority of Iraqis are thinking now. They think al-Maliki is supported by both Iran and the United States. He recently received an Airbus from Iran, and he has full support of President Bush, and the same as most of the others. So the picture is really not clear. We wish those two wise men, the ambassadors, will appear on a press conference and tell us what's really going on.
All right, Mr. Nazal, I'm going to have to stop because I want to broaden it out just a little bit here. Mr. Morandi, the Baker-Hamilton report, members of Congress, even the New York Times in a recent editorial called for the United States to engage Iran more directly and cut some of the loaded rhetoric. What about from within Iran itself? Is President Ahmadinejad under pressure from within Iran to cut some of the rhetoric and engage the United States in a more direct way?
I think in Iran there is a broad agreement at the moment that if the United States does change its behavior, if it behaves more reasonably, Iran is willing to do business. This is the message that comes out from the Supreme National Security Council. It's been stated by the Foreign Ministry itself. The representative who's been speaking to the Americans in Baghdad is from the Foreign Ministry, who's a part of the Ahmadinejad administration. So I think, yes, the Iranians are willing to talk. But again, as you've pointed out, the Americans show such a sheer and irrational, the American government shows such a sheer and irrational hatred towards Iran that it is very difficult for Iran to move forward. And on the other hand, the very fact that the Americans are officially supporting groups to undermine stability in the country is itself not helpful. If the Americans really want to move forward, I think they should try to gain Iran's confidence and behave in a more responsible fashion. It is extremely important for Iran to have a stable Iraq. Just like Iran right now supports the government in Afghanistan, despite the fact that it opposes American occupation, Iran supports the elected government in Iraq as well. Without a doubt, the government in Iraq has its problems, but Iran does truly believe that this democratically elected government should be supported, and it hopes that it becomes more inclusive.
All right, I'm going to have to stop you there. I'm sorry to interrupt because there's less than a minute left on the show, and I want to ask Raymond Tanter his opinion. Very briefly, sir, if the US leaves in a hurry, are they afraid of an Iranian power grab?
There has already been an Iranian power grab. When in the dust-up before Saddam Hussein was taken down, there were negotiations between the government of Iran and the United States that if the United States struck the bases at Camp Ashraf, where the Mujahideen-ul-Khalq were located, then Iran would not send the Badr Corps or the Supreme Council of the Islamic Revolutionary Guards into Iraq. Well, Saddam fell on April 9th, and on May 10th and 11th, Hakim and various other members of the Supreme Council of the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps came into Iraq contrary to the promises of the Iranian government.
All right,
so,
Mr. Tanter, I'm going to have to stop it there and leave it there. We've run out of time on the show. Thank you very much, gentlemen, in Washington, Tehran, and
Thank you.
Amman, and thank you very much for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story.